As we await the Christmas kind of holiday pattern change that we're expecting here this week with the big warm up across, frankly, many areas across the continental U.S., there's some winds of change in the atmosphere as that pattern change kind of takes place. Quite literally, high wind warnings across a wide area of the northern tier of the country, Montana, over toward Washington, Oregon, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota. These wind advisories extending into Minnesota for a significant wind event that's really ongoing now this morning, particularly the high plains, but then another cold front moving through on Wednesday. That's responsible for, I think, a lot of the high wind watches and the high wind warnings that you can see posted here. We also have red flag warnings in Colorado. High winds coming over, downsloping. They'll be warm along an area that's been lacking precipitation early this winter. We've seen those complaints from the ski resorts here. Northwest has been dealing with a lot of flooding issues as well. We saw the Snoqualmie Pass issues, even some evacuation warnings posted over the last 48 hours or so. And then over in the southeast, a freeze warning, some cool overnight temperatures that have settled in. If we jump over and look at just the current winds here this morning, not hard to find. This has been kind of a common theme as we've looked at these winds early in the morning of these high surface wind gusts in Montana, even portions of Wyoming here this morning. Additional winds coming on shore with the cold front over the next 24 hours. We'll look at that in a second. Also can see something, if you look down here in the southeast, pretty close to where we saw those freeze warnings and the frost advisories, right underneath this high pressure system. In fact, if you had to draw the H, it would be right here where these calm winds are. And around the high, the air flows clockwise like that. So right in the middle, there's our high pressure system, calm winds. That's usually a recipe for very cold overnight temperatures. And as a result, that's right where we saw those freeze advisories. So if we jump over and look at those current temps here this morning, see 19 Atlanta underneath that high pressure, the coldest air kind of right in here, at least kind of relative to the southeastern regional area, that lining up nicely. You can also see the snowpack that we built in over the last 72 hours across the Midwest over toward New Jersey with those much cooler temperatures in an otherwise kind of broad area of cold, chilly air here on this December morning. We can also see, looking toward the west, the downsloping wind, the southerly wind on the back side of the system, that high pressure system drawing air up like this. We talked about that clockwise flow. Winds out of the south, winds out of the west, especially on the plains, warming up air temperatures as you go further west. That's going to be the theme this week as this warmth spreads across the central U.S. We'll look at that here, just the surface max pressure. If we look at the maximum temperatures here, these are the daytime highs from the National Digital Forecast Database. That's just the National Weather Service, their forecast output here. High temperatures now spreading across the plains today, 60s in areas like Kansas, Nebraska. You get into the areas that have snow cover, and that's going to kind of buffer those high temperatures a bit. That snow has to melt and then evaporate, and those are both cooling processes. So as they do that, they're going to kind of resist the warm up a bit initially as we melt that snowpack. But still looking at 40s across the northern plains, mid to upper 30s in the Midwest, which will feel like a reprieve given that last few nights we've been down into the single digits, if not far into the negatives in some of the areas here under the thickest snowpack. I mentioned that Thule fog. You can see the influence that has on those California temperatures, keeping those highs much cooler than the surrounding foothills, an impressive inversion that we've seen set up underneath the ridge and the high pressure system that's been situated over California. Of course, we're changing that pattern over the next 10 days. So you'd think the Thule fog would help to get kind of stirred up and kicked out of the area as a result of that. I'm going to play this forecast forward. We'll do this kind of at the end as well, looking at long-range temperatures, but while it's up, might as well look at the temperature change tomorrow into Wednesday, where that warm spreads further east over the Atlantic coast. That cold front I mentioned on Wednesday sweeps through the northwest into the northern plains, bringing those high winds, responsible for all the beige colors that we saw on the map a few slides ago. That brings temperatures down briefly, especially for the plains in the Midwest. But the warm up on the backside, even more aggressive, more anomalous on Friday heading into the weekend. That quickly replaces that cold air that came through on Wednesday and Thursday. And we kind of keep this little bit of a roller coaster through the northern tier with these cold fronts swinging through. But by and large, for much of the continental U.S., a significant warming trend over the next 7 to 10 days. I could probably extend that forecast out to 15 days based on what's left to talk about in the video. But I'll just kind of spoil that now, that this warm trend seems to have staying power, especially in the middle part of the country. Now, part of that reason, we're looking at it here in the upper level jet stream. My eyes are focused here, the North Pacific near Alaska, the Aleutians here. This ridge, kind of Drought and the jet stream flow, is just north and kind of paired with a trough right to its south. We call this a Rex block meteorologically. And these Rex blocks, much like an Omega block, we talked about one of those last week, tend to be sticky. So this ridge this blocking system is probably here for a while, and it tends to produce this trough downstream of it, right here across the western U.S. This is actually going to further amplify over the next kind of 5 days, such that this trough bleeds further down into the southern U.S., particularly the southern western U.S., I should say more appropriately, into California, bringing flow, precipitation there, snowfall to the Sierra Nevadas. We'll get those specifics in a second here. And it's going to help a ridge necessarily form downstream of that trough across the central U.S. You can actually kind of already see that starting to take shape. This pattern here looks different than what it has over the last 20 days, where instead of kind of flow coming around like that, we've had flow crashing down out of the northwest, bringing these systems across into the Midwest. The lake effect snow. We mentioned all the snowfall for the Midwest over into New Jersey. I mean, that has been the flow pattern, and it's starting to flip around here this week. Now, I went ahead just from November, I think November 23rd. I averaged that flow pattern from the 23rd through December 13th. And there's that ridge over California, responsible for the Thule fog and the inversion. You can think of a ridge like warm air aloft, helping to promote that inversion there. And there's that flow. The jet stream's going to flow in between the trough and the ridge. And so the flows come around like this, kind of like I painted just a second ago. This is the pattern that we're quite literally flipping around. You just reverse the color bar, if you will, and we're going to see flow more like that over the next 10 to 15 days. Now, as a result of this pattern that we're looking at here, we look over the last 14 days of precipitation. I'll make this a bit bigger. As you'd imagine, underneath that ridge, California dry, much of Oregon dry, in fact. And with that ridge, bringing those warmer temperatures aloft, those warmer temperatures on the foothills, those have raised snow levels when we have had snow come through the northwest. So that has prompted a lot of this flooding in the northwest. We haven't had quite as much of this falling as snow. The snow levels have been way high up into like Mount Rainier, and that's allowed the flooding to be almost historically bad. It's not necessarily that the atmospheric rivers coming through here were so extreme. It was just that so much of it was falling as water, immediately moving into the hydrology, and the system's not allowing it to form as snow and delay that melt over the course of 6 months. You're seeing it all, in 6 hours if it falls as rain. That flow coming out of the northwest, like I said, plenty of precipitation kind of in this quarter here, especially with respect to snowfall, but we've been dry underneath it. We've had a few of these coastal lows that swing through the southeast, but this area has gone over dry. And we'll have to kind of keep an eye on this, given the dryness in the forecast as well. If we look at the current wind speeds here this morning, particularly the maximum wind gusts, you can see here in the high plains into the Canadian prairie. Wind gusts up to the 60s, even kind of flirting with 70s in some of the mountain ranges here in central Montana. I'm going to play this forecast forward, however, from the 3-kilometer NAM late through Tuesday. Notice tonight, overnight, cold front comes on shore in Oregon. Wind gusts pick up in the interior into the 50s and 60s. This comes over Idaho and then back through Montana. I'll mind you, this is cumulative, so that's why these are staying up here. Those wind gusts now cross the Bitterroot Range into the Rockies here. Those 50s and 60s, even 70s, 80s plus. It wouldn't shock me if, again, we get up like 90, even like 100 in some of the mountain peaks there. This is now Wednesday morning. And then much stronger wind gusts Wednesday daytime for the Golden Triangle, Montana, up near 70 miles an hour. You're starting to get into that damaging threshold at this point, into 70, 75. Wyoming getting up near 70, even some of the habited places here. And then look at the winds now Wednesday evening, pushing out into the plains, 50s and 60s for the Dakotas, even Nebraska here. I'll play this forward. And a stretch of very strong wind gusts moving through the Black Hills, northeast Wyoming, even into the Sandhills of Nebraska, and then outside of that, even like 50s here. So an impressive wind event over the next 48 hours. I'll blow this up a little bit. I'll just take it all the way through. This takes us through Thursday and toward lunchtime, and those high winds moving all the way down into Kansas. You can see that cold front as it comes over, bringing a stretch of damaging wind gusts all the way from the Golden Triangle through the Black Hills, even into like west central Kansas as we go from Wednesday into Thursday here. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Some strong wind gusts outside of that as well, looking over into southwest Minnesota, up into the 60s, maybe even the 70s, localized areas here, even eastern North Dakota. Plains looking at a significant wind event. You can see the reason for those widespread high wind watches and warnings. I'd expect those to continue to populate as this forecast comes a little bit clearer for the National Weather Service. I want to jump over and look at the drought monitor. This is not the flat drought monitor. This is the 8-week change map to see where it has been. Drought has been getting worse, where it's been getting better. I do want to mention, just in the last 8 weeks, this area here and in Nebraska has gone over a bit drier, even over here in north central Montana. I mentioned that because those high winds are coming over the next 48 hours. We do have red flag warnings posted for portions of Colorado here, especially along the Front Range. So we'll have to keep an eye on these areas for fire risk. These kind of wintertime cold fronts can still breed an excessive fire risk, especially considering kind of some of the HVAC situations that people are running in the colder air as well. So want to mention that, be mindful of that over the next 48 to 72 hours. I did want to play the 500 millibar jet stream forecast forward. We're looking at the troughs and the ridges here really with the ECMWF AIFS. I'm going to pick on this model initially. So it's done a pretty good job with this pattern change. And we're going to look initially. I want to keep an eye on this ridge here, almost off the screen to the west. And then this little shortwave trough now coming on shore tonight and Wednesday. That's when we saw those winds pick up across Oregon and Washington. There's going to be a rainfall component with this as well that we'll look at. That crashes through Montana Wednesday at lunchtime when those high winds picked up there. Moving through Wyoming, the Dakota borders Wednesday evening. And then overnight, early Thursday, now pushing into like Nebraska, western South Dakota, before Thursday coming out into the Central Plains near like Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota by Thursday lunchtime. That low moves through the Midwest. There'll be a precipitation and snow component with that. We'll look at that. Ridging here over California and the Southwest starts to expand after that this weekend, back into the central U.S. Another weak system kind of moving along the border states here this weekend. But that ridge continues to strengthen as we've kept this ridge here near Alaska, near the Aleutians, north of Hawaii, looking a little bit more Rex blocked, or I should say Omega blocked this time rather than Rex block. And that's keeping that trough here across the west. Now we have that southwest flow over California, Oregon, and Washington. If I play this forecast forward, we actually see that jet dipping further to the south, perhaps bringing Southern California into play. And this ridge just parked. Now Christmas, this is Thursday, December 25th, Christmas evening. Big ridge posted over the central U.S. Cooler weather expected for New England, on the backside of the trough there. Disturbed weather for the western U.S. with rainfall and snow in the mountains. And fair weather across a wide portion of the country. At this point, all that snow is going to be melted in these corridors here by next week. And I can play this forecast forward. There's a little system cutting through late Christmas week. Ridge turns right back, trough, ridge. Highly amplified pattern with this blocked system over in the Central Pacific. We need something to break that up if you want to change this pattern heading into the new year. We just don't see it in the long-range models. Another way we can look at this, Eric and I have been showing these Hofmuller diagrams showing where that ridge is positioned over the Pacific and the forecast where the trough is positioned as well. Man, you can see it. That is a expanding dominant ridge in the forecast. This takes us all the way out to New Year's Eve. And if anything, that ridge is just getting stronger, more amplified. That trough is entrenched across the west, and necessarily we have a ridge somewhere here in the eastern U.S., if not the central U.S. So this pattern, it has staying power. It's going to last into January. How far? It's anybody's guess right now. Don't see a lot of signals as to what might kick it up and out of here. These blocks tend to stick around for at least 2 weeks, and that seems to be the case in the forecast. December 11th, going back in time all the way out to the 31st. So a good 2 to 3 weeks now that this block is set up and is going to influence our weather. Now I want to show that precipitation story because we talked about it as those troughs are moving through. Play this into tonight. Let's do Wednesday at midnight. There's that cold front coming on shore in Oregon, Washington. Additional precipitation, those flood watches out for western Washington, those high snow levels in the northern Cascades. We'll see some snowfall get into the Oregon Cascades, but that system now Wednesday at lunch moving into Montana. You can actually see this deep 978 low here over Alberta, helping to fuel those strong winds right through here. Heavy snow over Yellowstone. That low kicks out onto the plains by midnight Thursday. That cold front extending down here. So the high winds kind of traveling along that. Snow up into Canada, if not North Dakota, by Thursday morning. Rain along that cold front here across much of the Midwest, but on the lighter side. Gets a little bit heavier by Thursday midday. Perhaps some mixed precipitation here. Some of this is the model struggling with the snowpack here, trying to keep those temperatures cooler over Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan. Another system now coming on shore in the northwest. Needed rainfall here for the central and southern Mississippi River Valley into the southeast. System continuing to exit to the east, largely a rain event. For much of the continental U.S. here, some snow on the backside, lake effect snow as well. We have another low moving through Saskatchewan here. This is now Friday morning. And system, look at the rain and the snow moving further to the south now as we hit Saturday, December 20th, as that trough sneaks further Further south, you can even see a weak atmospheric river now setting up. Little low skirting through this weekend. Again, the border states. Rainfall picking up for Central California, now Oregon. Additional snowfall for the Idaho mountains here. And just continuing that pattern. Almost atmospheric river-like event here for Northern California on Monday. Weak system moving through continental U.S. early Christmas week. Snow up into Canada, weak rainfall kind of stretching back along that front here across the eastern U.S. And then Wednesday, now Christmas Eve, I mentioned that disturbed weather potential as we approach Christmas. There's this low coming on shore near Northern California. Heavy rain now spreading across the state. Sierra Nevada is getting heavier snowfall. Rain for western Oregon before that pushes on shore. And this is now Thursday and Christmas. Largely fair across the eastern continental U.S., maybe the 2/3 of it, and more inclement across the western U.S. by Christmas time. Play this a little bit forward. You can see maybe some low trying to track up here at the end of the week on Christmas. I mentioned that possibility as we walked through the 500 millibar height forecast, but the rain continuing for California and the western U.S. even well out into the forecast with this pattern as entrenched as it is. If we look at the GFS, I'm going to kind of go quickly. There's that system this week bringing the rain to much of the central and eastern U.S., even to the southern U.S. Rain picks up, obviously, in the northwest. Take this quickly through. You can see Northern California now this weekend, getting in on the rainfall. The GFS has weaker systems moving through earlier in the week compared to the ECMWF, so it keeps it largely clear and warm across this area here, save for portions of New England. But as we go into Christmas Eve, see the rainfall picking up for California. In some locations, not quite as strong as the ECMWF. That low now moving up through Christmas Day, and generally less precipitation for the west on this GFS model. It's keeping the low a little bit more amplified back to the west before that finally comes on shore much later into the forecast. The GFS a little bit drier overall, with the forecast strangely having a more amplified pattern than the ECMWF. Now, if we look at the snowfall forecast, I just took it all the way out to the end of the forecast because you can see the west getting improved snowpack. Not so much the Colorado, the Rockies near Utah. The Sierra Nevadas, this is better than we've seen. At least it's some. This is the Cascades in Oregon. It's better than we've seen. It's a nice healthy shot of like 2 feet, maybe 3 feet of snowfall, but it's not as much as it could be. The snow level is still a little bit higher as this initially comes through. So the best kind of snow potential more in that like late next week time frame than in the early week as the system kind of really gets its act going. Outside of the west, can see this corridor of heavier snow across Canada. Almost kind of well up into Canada in some cases, and the lake effect machine not nearly as potent here over the next 14 days, given the warmth that's going to be pushing in here than it has been here in the early half of December. As for the continental U.S., snow kind of taking a break for a lot of the areas of the continental U.S. here through the end of December. Frankly, we'll see if we can get some systems in kind of that last week before New Year's back down into the Midwest, but it's not looking too likely at this point. If we look at the precipitation departures over the next 10 days, we'll kind of walk through this slowly. Here's the next 5 days. See this quarter here over the west, these systems moving through Canada, that initial system here this week pushing through the end of the week through the eastern U.S., bringing rainfall to this corridor here. But as we go out a little bit further, 7 days, this area is starting to go over drier on the anomalies. That rainfall inching further south into central California, like Sacramento, San Francisco by next week. Further south, if we go the 4 to 10 days, much drier now in the southeast and the eastern U.S. Putting it that all together in the 10 days, see that atmospheric river event moving further south. As we go through the forecast, we get drier the further out we go, and that snowfall staying off to the north, at least through the December 26th. It would not shock me if this pattern continues through the 1st or even the 5th of January. And that's starting to concern me for the southeast a bit, because this area has snowpack on the ground. In fact, this area is going to get, an inch or two of water just melting all the snow that we've seen here. So the soil moisture concerns here are largely being relieved. I'm still worried about these areas here in Nebraska and the Front Range, but the south, a lot of areas in here still dealing with kind of the lingering effects of some fall drought, and we're not expecting much rainfall over the next 10 days. That's an area we're going to have to continue to watch as we look out through the rest of winter. Now, another significant piece of this are the temperatures. We kind of already walked through these in the first kind of 7 days from the NDFD, so I'm kind of taking this through quickly. We get into Thursday here. I'll take it out to lunchtime. By Thursday, 50s, getting into the Midwest, upper 30s through Wisconsin and Michigan. There's that cold front coming through midweek. Pushes into the Midwest. likely a little bit of snow cover lingering at this point from the melt in the middle of the week. See that cold front swinging through Friday. But as we go through the day Saturday, I'm going to take this back to lunchtime Saturday. Look at the temperatures have already rebounded behind that front, save for areas across the northern plains. If I take this into early next week, this is now Sunday. Another cold front swings through. Temperatures cool down initially, but that warm up comes right back on the back side. Monday, looking at 50s over in western Nebraska along the Front Range and the High Plains, 40s up into Montana. Tuesday, temperatures warming. That 50 line sneaking for the north back into the Midwest. Those cold temperatures kind of hold up here over Canada, northern Minnesota, and North Dakota. Wednesday, Christmas Eve. Again, more warmth across the central U.S., especially over toward the kind of mid-Atlantic coastline now at this point. New York, Boston, still cold and chilly, kind of under the influence of that New England trough. But by Christmas, I mean, we're way out now, 9-day forecast at this point, but that is an impressively warm Christmas forecast from the ECMWF. This would be probably in some of these areas near record territory, 70s across a wide chunk of the central and southeastern U.S., 60s up through the Midwest and the Central Plains, 40s for the upper Midwest. I mean, to get freezing on Christmas, you have to go up into New England, like New Hampshire, all the way up into northern Montana or northern North Dakota. If this verifies, that's going to be a very warm Christmas, which is ironic considering how cold we started and how snowy we started in this corridor in December. Now, if I take the forecast way out, I'm all the way now out like 14, 15 days from the ECMWF ensemble. I'm waiting to see if we can break this omega block that's set up here across the Pacific and break the ridging here in the middle part of the country. And I don't see much signal of that. ECMWF ensemble hanging on to it all the way till New Year's Eve. Still seeing that dominant ridging over the North Pacific, not changing at all from where we started this forecast now 15 days out. And that necessarily is going to put some sort of ridging downstream in much of the eastern two-thirds of the continental U.S. So without anything obvious in the long range to break this pattern down, Climate Prediction Center going warm over that whole area, save for New England. As far as precipitation is concerned, I mean, that's set up. That's good for California, Oregon, and Washington, maybe even like central California. Their 8 to 14-day precipitation outlook, wetter for the western U.S., drier for the southeast, that area I was concerned about. We were concerned about this area going back to like late November, given some of the seasonal forecasts here. And it's another reason we weren't kind of blaring the alarm for the western precipitation situation. We know how fast it can change with some of these pattern changes and how wet it can turn. And that seems to be coming to fruition with this holiday pattern change. As a result of that, Climate Prediction Center highlighting a high risk for heavy snowfall for the Sierra Nevadas in the long range as we approach New Year's Eve. That is good news for folks rooting for more snow there. Slight risk out for the Central Rockies. Still a little bit concerned about this area here. They're not seeing as much snowfall from this configuration. That kind of concerns me a little bit for the kind of Colorado River Basin going into the new year. Less concerned for California hydrology, obviously, with this kind of next round of precipitation with this pattern change. We can see that with the risk of heavy precipitation from the 23rd through the 29th, again from the CPC. That high risk along the California coast flooding is going to return back to the lexicon here as we go through the holiday week and the following. And then broader kind of moderate and slight risk beyond that. I'm looking at the MJO here. Obviously, Eric and I have been tracking this. If you're waiting to kind of see a big signal and pattern change from the MJO, it's just not here. Even in the ECMWF extended model, we kind of theorize, well, it might pop out into phase 5, go back through phase 6 and 7, or phase 4, 5, 6, and 7 like that. Not seeing that in the long range. If anything, it's trying to leak back, maybe back out into phase 8, kind of stay where it was after it left back into null space. But again, we were just in phase 8 kind of to start December, and we kind of know what that's one of our colder phases. And if I take you phase 8 and like the middle of January, the early part of January, it actually flips this around, puts a ridge in the west over the Canadian Prairie, and troughing in the east. And that would flip the temperatures around in a big way over in the Canadian Prairie, where it's been very cold, where it's expected to be very cold. Kind of glossed over that as we went quickly through the temperature forecast. But if you kept your eye on Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia through the forecast, I mean, just locked into that Arctic air throughout much of the forecast. And that would be a big pattern change. So that's not clear right now from any sort of long-range models. We obviously don't have a window into January at this point in the dynamical models, but that would be a big pattern flip from where we're currently at. If I do kind of poke around in the long range from the ECMWF extended model, these are 7-day rolling temperature anomalies. And then I take this through January 1st, actually all the way out through January 3rd, we can see the large warm-up expected, save for New England, portions of the West Coast where rain will be falling through this time period. And I get this out to like the middle part of January. That middle week, we see the cold continuing here, but starting to push back out into the central U.S., kind of reminiscent of that pattern that we saw earlier in December. And so something to keep an eye on, that at least the ECMWF extended model flips us back into a colder pattern through this corridor here in January. But that's pretty far out at this point, and about the only thing we have to go off of. We still need to break that ridge in the Central Pacific, and until something kind of shows up reliably to break that, let's see if we can pull that up again. That's going to be the dominant player in this forecast. I went back to 17 and 18 to see what that January was like. 17, 18 is going to be an interesting analog at times this year, so I've kind of kept my eye on it. If we look at December 2017, temperature departures, we were warm in the west, cooler for the eastern, kind of 2/3 of the country, at least seasonal in some of these areas here across the southeast. Not totally dissimilar from where we were. Certainly the lake effect snow machine was cranking in both years. And a lot of the cold fronts move through like this with snowfall in these areas. And if I show you 2017 to 18 January, actually stayed cold. We brought warmth back to the northwest, and we pushed colder even further toward the south through Texas and the southeast as we went into January, kind of amplifying the pattern in that regard. So at least kind of one feather in the cap, maybe the ECMWF pattern flip that it is advertising at some point in mid-January. But again, that is 30 days away, and we'll have to look at that when we get to it. I'll leave there today. Eric will talk with you tomorrow on Wednesday. As for today, thanks for watching.